In 1937, a book hit the shelves called The First Rebel by Neil H. Swanson. Swanson was a well-known author of historic novels in the 1930s and the 1940s, where his books were read by many people who found the frontier life in the Wild West truly entertaining genres. It was this public interest in these subjects that spawned the Western craze of the 40s and the 50s in America. Swanson's book, however, was not about the simpler times of gunfights and bad guys in the lawless towns of the great American West, but about a man who was captured by Indians, lived with them, and came back to his former life and used his new knowledge of Indian culture to protect the people on his frontier from these Indian raiders. It is a neat little story, but it turned out to not be a story at all. Though Swanson wrote his book in an entertaining way, so it read like a novel, the story of this young man was very much true. Historical records and the boy's own first-hand account of his experiences were well recorded in the historical record. But the last part of the novel explains a series of events that were so outlandish to be true, as this boy-turned-man led a group of armed civilians in an uprising against British soldiers in 1765, a whole 10 years before the beginning of the American Revolution in Lexington, Massachusetts. The action in the story was so riveting that Hollywood made it into a movie in 1939 called Allegheny Uprising, starring none other than John Wayne as this young man, and loosely based on the actual story. The story was so captivating, it had to be made up, like so many of those Western books and movies. There is no way any of this could have happened, or did it? In the back of each copy of Swanson's book was an appendix that contained letters and court depositions that described everything in this storyline. These letters and depositions were from various characters in the book, including the young boy, James Smith, his brother-in-law, William Smith, Esquire, Lieutenant Charles Grant of Fort Loudon and commander of Black Watch, Pennsylvania Governor John Penn, and British General Thomas Gage. All real people in history. The letters were all written in an older dialect dating back to the 1700s, suggesting that they were actual letters and depositions written by these people. But Swanson gave no sources on where he found these documents. It turns out that almost all of these letters in the back of this book are found in the Colonial Records of Pennsylvania, Volume 9, proving that these letters are real and the events that they describe did indeed happen. Though Swanson's first Rebel book and his movie disappeared in importance over time, Swanson's efforts preserved a piece of history that was long forgotten. A true story about a group of citizens who stood up for their rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness 11 years before Thomas Jefferson wrote those words in the Declaration of Independence. A group of citizens that stood up for the civil law and decentralization of government and denounced tyrannical behavior of the British military. A group of citizens who were located on one of the most remote places of the British Empire, but yet were reported on by London newspapers and discussed by Ben Franklin and King George III himself. Join me as I explore the stories and locations of this lost but important event in history in the area around Mercersburg, Pennsylvania, that helped contribute to the creation of the United States of America. This is the true story of the Black Boy Rebellion. James Smith, son of a Scotch-Irish immigrant, at the age of 18 was captured by Indians on July the 1st, 1755, while working on a Pennsylvania military road being built west from Fort McDowell, located in the Conococheague settlement near what is now Marks, Pennsylvania today. This military road was to support the efforts of British General Edward Braddock as he assaulted the French Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio in modern-day Pittsburgh today. James was taken to Fort Duquesne and was nearly beaten to death in the Indian ritual called the running of the gauntlet. After James recovered from his wounds, he was adopted by the Conococheague tribe, a tribe of Mohawk Indians living in modern-day Ohio. He lived with his Conococheague brethren for 5 years, learning their culture, languages, and mode of warfare. James then escaped his Indian captors in Canada and boarded a French prisoner ship of English prisoners in hopes he would be taken to England for prisoner exchange as the 7 Years' War between England and France raged on around the world. Instead, he was kept in prison for 4 months in French-controlled Montreal until he was taken to Fort Crown Point along Lake Champlain along the modern New York state border and exchanged as a prisoner, freeing him to go back home to the Conococheague settlement sometime in late 1760. So behind me here, you will see Mount Parnell. And then just below that, there's a farm in the distance here. And in and around that farm somewhere, down towards the creek, is where James Smith would have settled when he returned from his Indian captivity. I am currently standing on what is called Mountain View, which is very close to the Mountain View Elementary School. I'm actually standing in the backyard of a fellow that was gracious enough to let me stand here and tell this story. But James Smith would have settled somewhere in and around here, most likely somewhere down towards where that farm is behind me. Now in May 1763, James married Ann Wilson of Peters Township after years of adjusting back to life among the Europeans after spending so many years living as a Native American. Up until 1763, Indian attacks on the frontier had died down after the British finally took Fort Duquesne in 1758, causing the Indians to make peace with the British. But 1763 brought new trouble in the form of Pontiac's War, in which Chief Pontiac united the many Indian tribes to attack frontier outposts and settlers along the frontier. Because of the Quaker government of Pennsylvania's policy of non-violence against the natives attacking the frontier, the settlers of the Conococheague settlement raised money to pay a group of riflemen for several months to help fend off Indian attacks. The committee in charge of this community action appointed James Smith as captain of this company of men, since he knew so much about the Indians and their tactics of war. Smith conscripted 2 young men as his lieutenants, who were also at one time Indian captives. They worked to train a ranger group in the art of Native American warfare. With skills such as tracking, camouflage, evasion, sneak attacks, and other guerrilla warfare techniques, these rangers were able to successfully deter Indian attacks in their settlement. Along with using Indian tactics, Smith dressed his men in Indian style, with breechclouts, leggings, moccasins, and shrouds. To help identify them from their enemy, they were dressed in green shrouds and red bandanas around their heads. The signature style of these rangers became their painted faces, as they wore native war paint of black and red for camouflage and scare tactics. For this style, this ranger group became known as the Black Boys. The Black Boys' method of lighting fires on the mountains and making a few men seem like 1,000, along with the skills that they acquired, proved effective. Their focus was deterring Indian attacks by tricking the native war parties into thinking that their numbers were greater than the native attackers. With too few warriors and a dwindling population, Native American forces would only attack if they knew that they had an advantage. And with his background while living with Indians for 5 years, James Smith understood how they thought. The money ran out from the local settlers to fund this ranger group, and they petitioned the Pennsylvania government to pick up the cost of their defense. Despite the Black Boys' success, the government refused to lend the aid needed to keep the Black Boys in operation. With the lack of money to properly pay the Black Boys, the ranger group ceased their patrols and dispersed back to their former lives as farmers and tradesmen. Without the Black Boys as a deterrent, the Indians were once again bold enough to carry out their attacks on the Conococheague settlement. Captain James Smith then joined for a short time the British forces to combat the Native Americans in the West. He then joined the Bouquet expedition into the Ohio in 1764 after the notorious Indian attack on the schoolhouse near modern-day Greencastle today that resulted in the deaths of the schoolmaster, Enoch Brown, and 10 of his pupils. With the help of James Smith's knowledge of the Ohio from his captivity experience, his ability to act as an interpreter, and his skills in Indian warfare, the expedition was a success that ended Pontiac's War and started the peace process with the Ohio Indians. The governor of the province of Pennsylvania signed a decree making trade illegal with the Indians until a peace was officially declared. After his war experience, James Smith returned home with the rank of lieutenant. James settled down back home with his wife and child to be a farmer, thinking that the Indian wars were over and his service was no longer needed. William Smith was a cousin and brother-in-law to James Smith. Even though William was not much older than his cousin James, when James's father passed away, William became one of the caretakers of James and his siblings. William was in charge of their well-being and education. In 1748, after William moved to the Conococheague settlement with his charges, he became a lieutenant in the local militia regiment. At some point, William married Mary Smith, who is James's sister, making him not only James's cousin, but also his brother-in-law. In 1755, William was one of 5 road commissioners that was in charge of building the supply road through Pennsylvania to assist with Braddock's army that was supposed to assault Fort Duquesne. William asked James to help as part of the road crew to help cut the road through the wilderness. While working on this road is when James was captured by Indians. In 1757, William became a Justice of the Peace of Cumberland County, which consisted of modern-day Franklin and Cumberland counties in Pennsylvania today, serving as judge, jailer, and policeman within the county. He was the representative of the law in his jurisdiction. In 1759, William Smith purchased from James Black a trading post and mill next to a small run that is now known as Johnson's Run. The town that was once known as Blackstown, or Black's Trading Post, became known as Squire Smith's Town. William added to his ground a home built with a basement designed like a jail to serve his needs as a justice of the peace, and the town grew in size. Eventually, William's son laid out the town in 1786 and renamed it Mercersburg, and it is currently Mercersburg, Pennsylvania today. The house that William Smith built would have sat, at least traditionally known, here on this piece of property right next to the MMP&W Fire Department. It is a vacant lot now, but the house used to sit here up until about 2011 when it was torn down. A son of a proud Scotsman, Charles Grant followed his family legacy of being a soldier by volunteering his services to the British Crown by joining the 77th Regiment of Foot, otherwise known as the Montgomery Scottish Highlanders. At age 18, Charles Grant served under the command of a relative named Major James Grant, who was ordered to scout ahead of the main force under General Forbes and spy on the French that held Fort Duquesne in 1758. Charles was caught in the fray when his commander decided to attempt to take the fort, and as the Scotsmen descended towards the fort wearing kilts and blowing on bagpipes, they were slaughtered by the French and Indian forces, resulting in Charles being captured by Native Americans. After being released in 1760 by his Indian captors, Charles Grant rejoined the army to see action in the Canadian campaign and then fought in the Caribbean. In 1764, Grant then served in the Bouquet expedition into the Ohio to end Pontiac's War. In this campaign, he was part of the 42nd Royal Highland Regiment of Foot, also known as Black Watch. He served alongside James Smith in this expedition. Soon afterwards, Grant was promoted to lieutenant and became commandant of Fort Loudon in the Conococheague settlement in present-day Fort Loudon, Pennsylvania, and not far from Squire Smith's town. And this is Fort Loudon that he was the commander of. Grant's Black Watch was to provide protection in case of Indian attack and maintain their section of the wagon road that led to Fort Pitt in western Pennsylvania. One of Grant's Scottish Highlanders was Sergeant Leonard McGlasson, who was a tough and no-holds-barred man. In 1763, Chief Pontiac united the Indian tribes together to attack white settlers that continued to settle on Indian land, starting what is known as Pontiac's War. This resulted in the British losing several forts and having others fall under attack by Indian war parties. In response, British Colonel Henry Bouquet led a force from Carlisle, Pennsylvania into western Pennsylvania to relieve a siege on Fort Pitt, clashing with Indian forces at the Battle of Bushy Run on August the 5th and 6th of 1763. By using Indian battle tactics, Bouquet's force defeated the native forces and relieved Fort Pitt, breaking the siege. This is the first time a British force successfully defeated a native force in a large battle. The defeat only angered the natives even more, resulting in raiding parties attacking settlers on the frontier in the spring and the summer of 1764, resulting in the capture and brutal murder of many settlers. Because of the war and the attacks on the frontier, the governor of Pennsylvania issued a decree saying that no trade with the Indians was allowed to occur until peace was officially brokered with the natives. This includes items such as metal scalping knives and metal tomahawks and guns, lead and gunpowder, all items that could be used to kill the frontier inhabitants of Pennsylvania. As discussed before, the people of the Conococheague settlement paid for and organized a group of rangers called the Black Boys under the command of James Smith to defend the settlement from Indian attacks. In late 1764, Colonel Henry Bouquet organized an expedition into the Ohio region to force a peace with the hostile Indian tribes centered out there, which essentially ended Pontiac's War. Again, this is the expedition that James Smith and Charles Grant both participated in. Militarily, Bouquet was able to force peace with the Indians by December of 1764. But to further cement this peace into something long-term and lasting, the British needed to come up with a plan to appease their disgruntled neighbors to the west. This is when they called on the services of a Mr. George Krogan. Native Americans at the time believed that the most important way to restore trust was through the act of ceremonial gift-giving when treaties were being signed. According to Sir William Johnson, the British Superintendent of Indian Affairs, if we conquer their prejudices by our generosity, they will lay aside their jealousies, and we may rest in security. This is much cheaper than any other plan and more certain of success. One of the British deputy superintendents of Indian affairs was given the job of cementing this peace in December of 1764. This man was Mr. George Croghan. Now, George Croghan was a man of dubious intentions and well known for it. He was described as rogue, dishonest, always suspect, wild, and a player. An Irishman by birth, Croghan came to the New World around 1741 and immediately began trading furs and goods with Indians. He learned their languages and their needs and their wants. With political connections and close contacts with powerful business merchants in Philadelphia, Croghan became a wealthy man, trading goods to Indians, making deals for the Pennsylvania government, and collecting land, and lots of it too. By 1773, Croghan laid claim to 1.5 million acres in western Pennsylvania, being the only European man allowed to own land in Indian territory. Croghan was so well connected and known. His house was listed on a map of Pennsylvania to show his location in Cumberland County. He may have been well connected and known, but he wasn't well respected. Edward Shippen, mayor of Philadelphia, said, "As a private person, I have no reason to say anything in favor of Mr. Croghan, but this I am pretty sure of, that if he could not bring in the Indians for a conference, no man on the continent could do it." A 1761 letter from William Potts at Fort Pitt accuses Croghan of making the mothers and grandmothers of the young women at a party so drunk that they forgot their jobs of protecting the chastity of their daughters, in which Croghan took full advantage of the situation. Croghan may have helped negotiate with Indians and put up money for forts to defend the frontier, but he was also a ruthless man, out to line his pockets with as much money as possible and take what he wanted, no matter who got hurt in the process. Croghan's plan was to launch one of the largest gift-giving ceremonies ever done with the Indians. He was going to make a treaty at Fort Pitt and then travel down the Ohio River to remote Indian villages and give gifts along the way. By the end, he hoped to find Pontiac himself and give gifts to finally end the war the war chief started. But as with everything with Croghan, it had to benefit himself also. Croghan was given 2,000 pounds, the British currency at the time, from General Thomas Gage, who was the Commander-in-Chief of British Armed Forces in North America, to purchase the goods necessary for trade. But what Croghan did not tell General Gage was that he had a side deal where he was going to make 25% of the profits on. In November, before Croghan was given this duty by the British military, he made a deal with a long-standing mercantile firm in Philadelphia called Brighton, Wharton, and Morgan, along with two trading partners, Robert Field and Robert Collender, to transport and provide 20,000 pounds of trade goods to the Western Indians. This was to make them the first available British traders to the natives once the war was over and trade was reopened after peace was established. Croghan felt that the 2,000 pounds allotted to him from the British government was not enough for his endeavor, so he combined his duties of diplomat for the British government with military money with his duties as a trader for his business partners, and combined the shipment into one large shipment. In January 1765, the goods were being gathered as Brighton, Morgan, and Morgan was having trouble finding enough goods to fill Croghan's order for the trade mission. The shipment included 5,700 shirts, enough to clothe more than half of the total male population of Indians in Ohio at the time. 1 ton of sugar, 1,800 gallons of rum, and bales of cloth, along with gunpowder and other goods. The shipment weighed around 44 tons and was worth anywhere between 20 to 30,000 pounds of British currency. Croghan was given a pass to move these goods to Fort Pitt by the area military commander, which was Colonel Henry Bouquet. Remember, Pennsylvania had a decree at this time that there was to be no trade with the Indians until official peace was reached with them. But during wartime, high-ranking military officials such as Gage and Bouquet could provide a pass for diplomatic or military purposes to move these goods. The problem is, Krogan was carrying way more goods than what Gage authorized, and a large majority of these goods were private, but traveling mistakenly under a military pass. As the winter of early 1765 dumped heavy snow over Pennsylvania, Croghan decided to leave Philadelphia to travel with only a light load of goods across Pennsylvania to Fort Pitt, entrusting his business partner, Captain Robert Callender, to transport the rest when the roads became clearer. On February the 28th, 1765, after a difficult journey on the snow-covered military roads, Croghan arrived at Fort Pitt. He now was waiting at the fort for the arrival of Callender and the remainder of the illegal trade goods traveling under a military pass, along with the king's goods that was bought for negotiating purposes. What Callender didn't realize was that the locals of the Conococheague settlement in Cumberland County were becoming suspicious of Croghan's plans, a suspicion that would result in Croghan's scheme literally going up in smoke.